to the March 2022 Cybersecurity Forum. We'll give a few minutes to allow folks to file in from the waiting room and to join the call, and then we will get started with this morning's Cybersecurity Forum. We've got a great panel. Looking forward to the discussion today. So.
Great, Damon. It looks like everybody's in if you want to get started.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So welcome again to our March session of the Cybersecurity Forum. I'm Damon Nix. I'm the Director of Business Development at InTech Washington, the state of Washington's Manufacturing Extension Center. Cybersecurity has never been more pertinent to all businesses, not just the DoD supply chain manufacturers, but also businesses and individuals regardless of industry. Companies are experiencing unprecedented levels of malicious activity. We know global events that are ongoing, sanctions from the West on Russia related to their invasion of Ukraine has certainly put not just countries, but companies and entities on alert for potential retaliatory cyber attacks. We know that corporations have been dealing with just an untold number of attacks. Just yesterday, I know this affected my teenagers, Spotify and Discord we're down with significant outages for an amount of time. At InTech Washington, we encounter weekly manufacturers that we speak to are dealing with attempted hacks to their business systems, phishing activity, and the like. Protecting the business intelligence, financial interest, and personal data held by enterprises is paramount today. And so that's why we're coming together with these talks. It's our hope that these cybersecurity forums will be one resource among many that are out there that will help you build a strong and proactive cybersecurity program. Our goal with the Cybersecurity Forum, as always, is to build a community, connecting manufacturers and businesses with experts in cyber, as well as economic development partners and other community-based resources. We want to establish a dialogue. We hope we'll do that today, offering you the ability to ask and get answers for your questions on the current state of cybersecurity. So I encourage you today to engage, ask questions, join the chat, build your network, and connect with the experts and partners here on the forum. You know, I can speak for InTech Washington and PNDC as well, and I think our panel of experts as well today, and say we all want to see you succeed in your journey towards cybersecurity. Our topic today is quite practical. Looking forward to the discussion. The topic is what's in your contract. And when it comes to cybersecurity compliance, it's critical to know what it is that we have actually agreed to comply with. This is really a part of our current state analysis and helps us build the basis for an effective and efficient cybersecurity program. So I'm looking forward to learning more on this topic today from our guest speaker, Howard Roth, and our wonderful panel of experts who are joining us today. But before we get started, I wanted again to thank our partner, PNDC, for being, well, one, just such a great partner, but helping us to produce and host these cybersecurity forums. To the director, Bud, as well as Kate, Denise, and the whole team at PNDC, thank you. And with that, I want to pass it over to Kate Canapo to share a few words and introductions. So thank you again all for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Damon. As Damon said, I'm Kate Canapo with Pacific Northwest Defense Coalition. We're a membership trade association for the Pacific Northwest defense and security industry. And we partner with InTech Washington on these programs because we know that cybersecurity is such an important part of the defense supply chain, keeping the whole supply chain secure and resilient. Being a defense organization, we always know that our mission is to support the people that serve in our military ultimately. So I want to invite any of those veterans or active duty service people on the line today to feel free to chat their service in the chat there so we can thank you. If we were in person, I'd ask you to stand, but we can't do that. But hopefully we will be doing that more and more here in the future, but please do chat your service so we can thank you, where you served, what branch, etc. Thank you. I'll also invite everybody to use the chat to introduce themselves. Please share your contact information, your LinkedIn link. As Damon mentioned, we want this to be a community, so we encourage you to go ahead and chat that. Do pay attention to the chats during today's program. We'll also be defining acronyms as we go along. I know cybersecurity can be acronym rich, so we'll try to keep up with that. At the end of the program, you are also able to download your chats. Just a quick hint to stay connected with everybody, right where you type a chat. If you click the three little dots, the ellipsis, you'll be able to download the chats. We will also, after the program, make a recording of this presentation available for you as well. We're going to, I've pulled up the agenda here. We'll have a welcome from Raj Sidhu with InTech first, then Howard Roth will talk about what's in your contract, and then we'll open it up for questions. This is really an opportunity for discussion, ask questions. We have an expert in contract law, somebody in insurance, people that have a lot of experience in helping companies become cybersecurity compliant, whether it be people, processes, or technology. When it comes time to ask questions, you can unmute to ask your question, or you're welcome to type them as you think of them in the chat. So first, it is my great pleasure to introduce Raj Sidhu with InTech Technologies here, our sponsor of today's program. Raj, you want to say a few words?
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, everyone. My name is Raj. I'm the founder and president of InTech Consulting. We have been working with manufacturers in the Pacific Northwest area for 7 years and helping them with overcoming challenges with their technology and compliance needs. And I'm really excited to participate in today's panel, and I'm excited to hopefully learn a few things, as well as hopefully help somebody through their CMMC journey.
Great. Thank you so much, Raj. And if you could chat your contact information, that would be great. If you haven't already, you probably have. Great. Awesome. I am next going to introduce Howard here with Howard Roth with Oles Morrison. Howard has over 35 years of experience handling federal procurement and contract law managers. And he's really a knowledgeable advisor in all stages of federal contract law. So he's going to be talking about, you guessed it, what's in your contract. Give me just a sec, Howard, if you want to say hi to everybody while I pull up your slide deck.
Hello, lawyers, what can we say? They're like dentists. No one really wants to see them, but I guess dentists probably are more loved than lawyers. But it's been like that forever. Shakespeare said, his famous line, which is why I wear bulletproof. He said, first thing, let's kill all the lawyers. So. Some things never change, but when you have a problem or you're trying to make sure that you're not going to get in trouble, it's always good to have somebody that you can counsel with. I have been around government contracts, since 1986. I'm retired judge advocate in the Army JAG Corps. Also, I was the commissioner of the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. If you ever have a dispute with the government, that's generally where contractors go to have those disputes resolved. I work a lot, in the areas of protests and requests for equitable adjustment. I mean, just like a dentist, you only go when you need, when you need the root canal. Unfortunately, people only really are going to pay if, they haven't gotten a contract and they want to get it for a protest, or they're not being paid for work that they're doing. Compliance is typically not high on the list, but then that leads to, you know, the root canal. So if you can do the compliance, with our other panelists, I highly recommend you do that.
Great. Howard, I think your slide should be up. Does everybody see those? Yeah, great. Awesome.
So, you know, what's in your contract? Well, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about CMMC 2.0 and the DFARS and your basic DFARS and FARS requirements, which should be in your contract. Next slide, please. So, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification 2.0. You know, in the beginning, DoD announced in 2020 the new cybersecurity system that they were going to put in place for government contractors and, very importantly, subcontractors to ensure protection of sensitive, unclassified information. And it's a three-tiered model, 3 key features. First off, the tiered, you know, it requires that you as a company have progressively advanced levels depending on the type and the sensitivity of the information. And as you'll see in a slide, there were originally 5 levels. That's now been reduced to 3. And the program also set forth the process for what you have to flow down to your subcontractors if you're a prime. Flow downs are the bane of everyone's existence. If you're a prime, you want to flow down everything. And if you're a sub, you want to have as minimal requirements as possible flowed down. This is one flow down that a prime has to flow down as stated in the clause. The other thing that was a real big deal with, and still is with CMMC, is the assessment requirement. That way the department could verify implementation of the standards for cybersecurity. Now, you know, one of the great criticisms of what we have now is that, you know, it allows a contractor essentially to police themselves, and they weren't doing the job that the Department of Defense really would have wanted in doing that. And that's why CMMC came down 1.0, which was fairly demanding in what needed to be done. And it's implemented through contracts. You know, it's implemented through the DFARS and FAR clause, and then there's a new DFARS clause, which isn't final yet, which you'll see appear in future in your contracts, that deals specifically with CMMC. And you know, the key thing is that CMMC has changed. It's not as onerous as it was, but the key features are still there. It's still a tiered model. It has assessment, and it's going to be implemented through contracts. Next slide, please. So CMMC 2.0, what happened? What did you do with level 2, level 4? You know, a lot of work went into those 2 levels, and they certainly are important, but it was just decided that the 5-tier model was too much. And so level 1 remains the same as in CMMC 1.0. Level 2 is eliminated. Level 3 now becomes level 2, and level 5 becomes level 3. Now, if you're not familiar with the levels, this will be meaningless. If you are familiar with the levels, then you're going to be ahead of the game with the next slide. The problem with CMMC 1 is it wanted too much of too many too fast. And so CMMC 2, and I'll have a little graphic in a moment that'll sort of compare 1 and 2 with a picture. I think, you know, it's helpful more than words on the printed page or my voice. But now CMMC 2.0 is going to require rulemaking. And you know, what is rulemaking? Well, the wonderful thing about living in the United States is that we're a nation of laws, and there really is due process. You know, bring lawyers, guns, and money, you know, when the whatever has hit the fan. Anything that becomes something that you as a company is going to have to perform or do, a rule is published and then in the Federal Register, and the Federal Register, wonderful reading. I love to read the Federal Register, all sorts of things, you know, rules from, you know, how to weed your marijuana crop to, you know, the latest vaccine that's that's being produced. And so there will be a rule that everybody pretty much knows what's going to be in it, but it'll be finalized, and then people can comment on it. And then once the comment period is over, then it will be published as the rule. So everybody will have a chance to comment. You can comment, you know, when it's published in the Federal Register, but that takes time. So that's going to take a year to two to happen. Now, when they originally published 1.0, they said it would take, you know, 12 to 24 months or 9 to 24 months from November of 2020. So, so clearly we're still within that first 2-year window for when they did one. It's possible it could happen soon, sooner rather than later. But I'm not going to, I never bet against the government if it's going to be later, because the government sells no wine before it's time, as they, you know, I'm dating myself. That used to be a commercial for Gallo wines. In the interim, what do you have to pay attention to? And that's the FAR and DFAR clauses remain in effect to protect federal contract information, what's known as FCI. You know, that's what the FAR speaks to, and controlled unclassified information, which is what the DFARS speaks to, although, you know, they call it CDI, controlled defense information. Next slide. So here we have the graphic, and on the left is the old model. If you knew about it, that's great. It shows you're on top of things, but it's been changed. And again, essentially 2 levels were cut out. And level 1, you have your 17 practices and an annual self-assessment. Level 2 clicks into the NIST 800-171, the 110 practices. You know, I'm just a mere lawyer, but, you know, I am told that, you know, because I work with a lot of small businesses, and people say, well, you know, most of what's in NIST, most companies should already be doing, or something close to it. And then I found that truly is not always the case, because it does take some level of effort and investment in your compliance. But I would say, you know, compliance is so important to making sure that you don't have to go see the dentist or talk to me. But this level 2 has a triennial third-party assessment. And the third-party assessment is one of the key elements of CMMC, you know, that is retained. And then you have your annual self-assessment for select programs. And then finally, level 3, expert, you still, based on the NIST, the 110 practices, but then there's a government-led assessment. And that's what's being worked on right now. Next slide. And here, for those that don't like pictures, you can see the different levels of CMMC. And again, it's 2.0. Level 1 is what they call foundational. At one point, they were calling these levels of hygiene, which I thought was interesting. But this requires your basic safeguarding requirements consistent with FAR 52204-21, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. But, you know, that's pretty much the basic. Annual self-assessments with an annual affirmation by defense industrial base company leadership. So you're going to, again, be policing yourself. Level 1, foundational. Level 2, advanced, which was the old level 3. If you were up on everything with CMMC 1.0, and this requires your full NIST 800-171 compliance. However, they got rid of some of the more nuanced of the 1.0 requirements. And it's, you know, lawyers love to use words like bifurcated. I first learned about bifurcated when I was a young and idealistic lawyer, and I was helping on a death penalty defense. And it's bifurcated. First, they find out, are you guilty of murdering the person or not? And then they bifurcate it. The second part is, do you get the death penalty or life in prison? So bifurcated. So here, your bifurcated assessment is they prioritize acquisitions involving controlled unclassified information are going to require an independent third party assessment. So they're going to prioritize. And how are you going to know this? Well, it's going to be in the solicitation. You know, you're going to know because you're going to be put on notice. And if you're a business development person, you know, that's one of the things you're going to want to know, because you're going to have to have level 2 to get the contract. And then non-prioritized acquisitions involving CUI will require an annual self-assessment and annual company affirmation. So we're back to, you know, basically the self-policing. And then level 3, which was the old level 5, requires an annual self-assessment and annual company affirmation, you know, something that pretty much a self-assessment you've got at each of the levels. And then it requires, again, the full NIST 800-171. But what makes this a little bit more interesting is the government-led assessments after the certification under a third-party assessor. Under level 2, that third-party assessor is going to is someone who's going to come in and see if you hired the right consultant to do what you need to do, such that, you know, you're going to be passed. While I know no one likes to talk about it, I mean, for lawyers, when this thing really does kick in, of course, some people are going to disagree and with both the government assessments and the third-party assessor. But for right now, why am I telling you about this? Because CMMC, they wanted it to be here basically now, and it's still not here yet because they went for too much. Next slide. You know, my experience with CMMC, you know, I'm in a support group now. We meet once a week. You know, I was in, you know, and we talk about CMC and how it's affected our lives. And I'm just kidding. I'm trying for lawyers and humor. It's not a good thing. You know, it's, you know, the 12-step process to deal with CMMC. I mean, the consultants are like, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, what is the government doing to us? But it doesn't promote, the CMC experience does not promote confidence that cyber or the supply chain security can be accomplished through regulations, contract terms, or mandatory self-party assessments. However, the prior approach of just relying on self-attestation, it didn't work. And there's all these threats out there. So, you know, what we're trying to get to is improve security. You know, how do we get there? And really, we're still on that road. And that was my, you know, professorial comment. And now we move into where the rubber meets the road. The next slide. What's the current state of play? for a moment, you can put CMMC aside because they're working on that final rule. You've got FAR 52-204-21. You immediately look in your prime contract, or if you are a subcontractor, in your subcontract to the flow downs, and see if FAR 52-204-21 has been flowed down. If it has, then you've got to meet the 15, and we'll mention this, you know, a little bit later, the 15 different elements that you've got to have that basic safeguarding program for covered information systems, and the information that you receive or that you create. Now, the big clause for anybody who has a DoD contract is the DFARS 252-204-7012, which is safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. And really, that's, if you've got that in your prime or your sub, you know, you've got to certify that you've got, you know, everything in place so that you can handle CUI, or, you know, or as they like to call it, CDI. Although they now have issued a new guide to really confuse things. See, lawyers look at what do the words say, and the DFARS clause talks about covered defense information, and they came out with a new guide, and what they did was they only call it CUI, and they took out all references to CDI, which from a legal perspective, you know, you've still got to comply with what the clause says, even though the guidance has now, you know, eliminated that particular term. So how do you comply with NIST? Well, they've got a couple of other DFARS clauses. 7019 gives you the assessment requirements, and then 20 goes into exactly how those you know, assessment requirements are implemented. Now, 7021 is going to be the CMMC level requirements. But this last one you don't have to worry about yet. Next slide. And the reason for that is because it's in the rulemaking, and the rulemaking has, you know, it's going to take at least a year. And you know, originally they said 2 years, and we're still within that period of time. So you're not going to have to comply with the 7021 until the rulemaking is complete, and so therefore it shouldn't be in your contract. Now, sometimes the contracting officer might, for whatever reason, put it in there, and if you're a prime, you should point it out and have them take it out. Unfortunately, if it is in the prime and it's flowed down to you on an awarded contract, you know, it's a little bit too late to take it out, but everyone can certainly understand that it won't apply. We talked about the multiple changes to 2.0 before, going from the 5 levels of hygiene, as they used to call it, to 3 levels. Next slide. So DFARS Clause 252-204-712. This is the mother of all, you know, cybersecurity clauses right now. And really, again, you got to look in your contract, look for this clause, and then read the clause. I mean, you probably, I know, are all familiar with it, but they want to ensure that controlled, unclassified DoD information on your internal system is safeguarded from cyber incidents. And I mean, quite frankly, even I get cyber incidents just on my own personal computer, and that's why we have the safeguards, you know, at my company, and that I also just do for my private computer. And any consequences with the loss of this information that the government knows about it through cyber incident reporting and a damage assessment process. And it was the single DoD-wide approach to safeguarding covered contractor information systems. Now, you may say, well, Howard, why did we have CMMC 1 and now CMMC 2? Because DoD found that this wasn't enough. But this is still a lot. I mean, this requires you to comply with the NIST standards. Next slide. So this is what you are going to undoubtedly have in your current and future contracts. This is what you should know about, and this is what you should be following as far as your own company compliance program. So again, reporting cyber incidents, flowing down in subcontracts. It has to be for, operationally critical support, or if the subcontract is going to involve covered defense information, CDI. Next slide, please. So, DFARS, like we said, it's looking at NIST 800-171, the Chapter 3 requirements. You as the contractor should have your security plan. That makes sense, right? And that plan will, specify how the requirements for security are going to be met, and how it's going to be implemented, and a plan of action. So, and you can combine what they like to call SSP and POA in a separate or a combined document. There's no particular format, although, there are plenty of examples. I will say, if you go onto most DoD websites, there's a great frequently asked questions for small businesses. When I have a small business client, I send them an email with those, with that outline that really explains, what you have to do from the Department of Defense's perspective to comply with NIST 800-171 and therefore the DFARS. Next slide. Okay, so your SSP, your system security plan, you got 14 categories. And again, I'm just a lawyer, but what people that I know tell me who are in the small businesses that have an IT guy at least, is that you should be doing a lot of this anyway. Access control, awareness and training, incident response is key, maintenance. Next slide. Risk assessment, your security assessment of your system, and all, again, the frequently asked questions that the Department of Defense has put together on these requirements are extremely helpful for a small business. It's just for small businesses that they put these frequently asked questions together. Next slide. So, what's covered, basically the government likes to use, lots of words to say what we all say, but in a different manner. Covered contractor information systems, CCIS, that hold covered defense information. So, you want to find, do we have CCIS, and does it hold CID, or CDI, or however you want to put it, which is all a sort of a subset in many ways of CUI, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, if it's in your contract or subcontract, the DFARS clause, then they're thinking that you've got these systems, and undoubtedly, if you're doing business today, that you do. So a CCIS is an unclassified information system that is owned or operated by a federal contractor and that processes or stores covered defense information, CDI. And I after years, and I was putting my slides together this morning, after years in the military, I was thinking CID, Criminal Investigation Division. Well, if you make sure that you have your CDI, that what your CDI is, then you won't end up with CID, which would be the Criminal Investigation Division coming to see you. So sorry for that typo. Next slide. So this leads to the whole thing of, Howard, what is covered defense information? So it's unclassified, controlled technical information or other information described in the Controlled Unclassified Information CUI Registry published by the National Records and Archives, NARA. You know, the interesting thing is that when you actually go to that registry, it's not very helpful. So, but if you go to the DFARS clause, and when in doubt, just always go to the clause, it talks about controlled technical information, you know, drawings, computer software. It requires safeguarding or dissemination controls. It means it's got to be marked or otherwise identified in the contract. And this is where the contracting officer, and if you're a sub, the primes contracts people talking to the contracting officer. You know, the government's supposed to mark this stuff. It's always good to get the dialogue going. If something's marked, okay, but if it's not marked, you know, nothing's marked in here. Because what you don't understand, what a lot of companies don't understand, is the DFARS clause, that this mother of all cyber clauses, it makes you as a company responsible for marking CDI that is collective, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by the contractor. So it makes you an adjunct to the government. And so, next slide. It makes you have to understand what is CUI. So, what is CUI? Well, the DoD 52,000.48 controlled unclassified information. And you know, they if you notice before, they were talking about CDI, whereas I had a typo there, CID. Well, which is really a you know, CUI can be CDI. And it confuses a lot of people. And so when they issued their manual, they issued it just for CUI. And there's a bullet I took out under the general DoD CUI procedures. Unclassified information associated with a law. Is this information associated with a law, a regulation, a government-wide policy identified as needing safeguarding? That's considered CUI. Now, what they interestingly did in this manual is they took out any reference to CDI. But the FAR clause that you would get in trouble for still, you know, talks to CDI. Can be a little bit confusing. And the authorized holder is responsible for determining whether information in a document or material falls into a CUI category and applying CUI markings and dissemination instructions accordingly. And like I said, the clause makes the contractor or the subcontractor an authorized holder. So it makes you responsible for marking information that you may create. And you've got to have there, you know, it tells you the minimum markings, and they say, you know, put CUI in a banner or footer on the document. This DoD 5248 is supposed to sort of fill in the, you know, all the nuances that aren't in, you know, the FAR 7012 clause and 7008 clauses are fairly brief. It also establishes an official DoD CUI registry. Next slide. So, I mean, the basic thing you got to figure out, folks, is what information is covered by this clause, this mother of all clauses, you know, which is what you really need to be concerned about. and it's covered defense information, which is a type of CUI, and they've got that manual to help you to do that. And you know, they tell you to go to this. I found, you know, when I first looked at this, that it was sort of like I would keep it with those dolls, you know, the Russian or Ukrainian. I don't want to, you know, where you open the doll and there's a little doll and there's another little doll and another little doll, and then there's nothing. And it takes a little bit of work, and there are matrices, you know, of questions and answers that you can use to sort of go through the clause to see whether or not you're going to, you know, what information you're going to be handling on your contract is CDI. Next clause. I mean, next slide. So you've also got to understand that you may not have the DFARS clause in your contract. You may just have the FAR clause. The FAR clause is less extensive security controls, and the important thing is they don't have the reporting requirements that the DFARS clause has in the FAR clause. Next slide. So the FAR is more limited and basic, but it's sort of like the little brother to the DFARS clause. I mean, this is the rule now, you know, it can be in your contracts. And it's the steps that a reasonable business should be taking, irrespective of the requirements, the DFARS mandates, to enhance the safeguarding of the information that's covered. And, you know, the FAR rule does not include mandatory cyber incident reporting, incident response, or data collection. There's no forensic analysis. The reporting and data collection elements, you know, that's typically what defense contractors have said has been, you know, the most work for them. And the FAR rule doesn't include the NIST 800-171 standards covering most government systems and the DFARS. Next slide. So Howard, what is it? It's 15 basic security controls. And of course, we've got to have we talked about CDI, which is in the clause, and CUI, which CDI is a type of CUI, but when they wrote the CUI manual, they decided to take out all references to CDI, thinking that it would make things easier, I suppose. But here it means information provided or generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service for the government. And it does not include publicly available information, which makes sense, or basic transactional information, you know, like information to process the all-important payment that you need. Next slide. So here are your 15 security controls. And you know, I'm not going to go through all of them because, I mean, you know, I think pretty much know all this, you know, but it's number 8, for instance, limit physical access to information systems, equipment, and operating environments to authorized individuals. I mean, that's something a prudent company should be doing already. You know, number 4, impose controls on information that is posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. Next slide, please. Again, number 15, periodic scans of information system and real-time scans of files. I mean, update malicious code protection mechanisms when new releases are available. Again, these are all sort of real basic things. They're below what the DFARS requires, but you know, a lot of times when the DFARS clause is going to be the one that you're dealing with, but you've got to know about this FAR clause also, because you want to see what's in your contract, and it'll be the DFARS clause that we went over, or it'll be this FAR clause. Next slide, please. CMMC, oh, he brought that up again. He said, Howard, I thought that we didn't have to worry about that right now. Well, you don't, but it's coming. And they've even got a DFARS clause that's coming for this. And that's clause 7021. So you want to, do you satisfy the FARS cybersecurity requirements? I mean, go through those 15 requirements. You need to. Do you satisfy the DFARS cybersecurity requirements? You know, go through the NIST. Go, you know, get that frequently asked questions for small businesses from the DoD website. You know, what are your most important contracts? In order to get most of the contracts that I see, you got to certify that you're compliant with the DFARS clause in any event. As far as business development with CMMC, you know, the solicitations are going to tell you, you're going to know that CMMC applies because it's going to have the 7021 clause in it. That clause, you know, they're going through the rulemaking, as we talked about, the comment period and everything. And, you know, probably a year from when they announced it, you know, that which could be this, you know, that would be, I guess, November of 2022, we might have that clause in your contract. So for business development purposes, you know, you're going to have to be ready to go, because if you don't have what's required, you won't be able to get a contract. Now, if you read the fine print, from the time that the new CMMC 2.0 DFARS clause is implemented, they're supposed to give everybody 6 months. So you could really, you know, you're going to have some time to get up and running. You know, do you have your plan or your, you know, your POAM? Next slide. So CMMC, it's still the future, but you've got existing obligations, and that's, you know, while the CMMC is establishing a framework of security controls, the 3 levels of hygiene. It's not here yet, but so you're going to remain subject to the existing compliance obligation. And you may say, well, Howard, what is that? Well, we've been talking about it. I say this over and over again. Read the clause, DFARS 252.204-7012. Read that clause. It tells you what to do. The CMMC establishes a mechanism for demonstrating compliance with safeguarding provisions. And these safeguarding provisions, like the DFARS clause and the FAR clause, remain in effect. And CMMC builds on those requirements. You know, all I can say is government, the Department of Defense spends upwards of $700 billion. It's a huge market. And the rest of the government also spends not as much, but it spends a lot of money. So, you know, this is a customer that's worthy. It's always there. The government never goes out of business. You know, the government prints their own money, which is all very handy. And so you'll never go wrong if you're in the government space. You'll have a lot more headaches, maybe different headaches than the civilian space, but in order to be in that space, you need to comply with the DFARS 7012. Next slide. And now we're to questions. I have no idea whether I went over. Please tell me, my system administrator.
Great. Thank you so much, Howard. Great information. And I will say that we'll invite all our panelists to come up on the line. I'll pull up that slide quickly, but a comment here. I think some people are in the DoD space, some are in other government contracting, and some are not. But your advice on reading the contract, making sure you understand, asking the right questions about what information needs to be protected. It really applies to everybody who most contracts do have some kind of cybersecurity requirement. Great. I'm going to invite all our panelists to come on the line here. Let me stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. Our panelists today, I'm going to pull up the slide again so we have everybody's name so everybody can see that here. I'm going to start with a question for Rick Rosenberry with Brownrigg Insurance. This is another contract, and I think Rick, you were going to, maybe you could introduce yourself and maybe share 2 to 3 minutes on kind of what to look for in cyber insurance contracts as well. And then Howard, I'm sure we will have some more questions for you here shortly.
Yeah, so I'm Rick Rosenberry, Brownrigg Insurance. We are located in the Pacific Northwest, and we do insurance, complete insurance programs for parts and components manufacturers, OEMs in the supply chain for aerospace and defense. And I've been specializing in helping people to get cyber insurance. And as far as the contract goes, in insurance, the application that you fill out for cyber insurance, that 99% of the time becomes part of your contract. And so you want to make sure that you understand all of the questions, and some of those questions can be a little bit ambiguous. So you want to check the definition section and make sure that you're understanding what exactly they're looking for. Recently, I've seen a lot of people either overestimating or underestimating how many records they have, because saying how many records do you have is can be interpreted in multiple ways. So for most insurance companies, it is any one business or any one person, no matter how much information you have on that person or business. So a person would be a name connected with pretty much anything else you can imagine. If you can trace back to that person, that's a record. But if you're working with, if you're B2B and you're working with a prime, and over 10 years, they've sent you a bunch of their information, that's still one record. So it's a good thing to take a look at. And I have a sheet that goes into definitions and defines records and makes it to where you can, if you do have an understanding of your total scope of records, you can state how many records you have, and that can help a significant savings on your insurance. Another thing to watch out for is in the contract, what are your responsibilities in case of a loss? So what's their timing for reporting? And so make sure you're incorporating that into your loss plan. Make sure your employees know what to do, who to call. Insurance companies nowadays are very proactive and trying to give you as many tools as you can to keep something from happening and to limit something when it does happen. So they are going to make sure that you have everything that you need in order to limit that. We're also seeing a much larger involvement of cybersecurity professionals, whether they are in-house or contracted out, being part of the process. Most large applications now, the ones that actually have a lot more information besides the old traditional application that was just like, do you have endpoint detection? Okay, you're good. So the new applications are asking for, okay, who is managing your cybersecurity? What's their contact information? And then it'll also ask for their qualifications. So what technical qualifications do they have? So I've been working with a lot of cybersecurity companies and helping them to make that process working with their customers a little smoother, because the traditional me working with the customer, and then the back and forth, it takes a lot of time now. It can be several hours. So if we can, incorporate that into a plan that works for each one of your customers, we can take that time down to, an hour, 30 minutes instead of 5 to 10 hours. And that's what I've seen, evolving in this cyber insurance space.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. Really appreciate it. And I think there's some requests for that how to define records sheets there in chat. So I encourage people to use the chat and make connections as well. I do want to introduce our other panelist, Scott Dawson with Core Solutions is on the line. Scott, did you want to, I know we've had a few questions come up about CUI, how to define it, how to maybe segregate it within your network. Do you want to introduce yourself and maybe give a few tips on how to sequester the CUI within your database? And again, CUI, controlled unclassified information. I will try not to use acronyms too much.
Sure, Kate. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. And I am president and co-founder of Core Business Solutions. We're a small business consulting and cybersecurity firm, generally working with small and micro-sized companies on various compliance requirements. Well, to the question you're asking, what is CUI? I think that's the big mystery at this point for many companies, because for many years now, the government has had these regulations in place defining CUI. That started in 2010 originally. And since then, the whole issue of marking the documents is still a, shall we say, work in process. And our speaker talked about CDI and other acronyms and markings that maybe folks are more used to, for official use only. That's a one that I think people are fairly familiar with. But they're trying to consolidate under this one label. But the documents, generally, the information in the documents are not labeled or not labeled consistently. So then what do you do? Our guidance for our clients is to take a better safe than sorry approach. So if there are any questions about what documentation you might receive or produce or utilize that's part of a DoD contract or contract with a prime, step number one, as mentioned earlier, check to see if the DFARS clause is in your contract, especially that 7012 clause, but also look for the 7019 and 7021 clauses as well. That will be your first signal that your customer believes they are giving you CUI as part of the contract. That's the reason that that clause is in the contract, is to protect this information. Second thing is, if you're not clear what documentation you need to protect, contact your customer as mentioned. And third, here's the better safe than sorry. You can protect everything related to that program, to that project, to that contract, as if it is CUI. So maybe it's a bit overkill, but it allows you to create an awareness within your organization about the need to protect the information associated with that contract. It can bring clarity to something that's not clear by just throwing that blanket over it and say, we're going to protect everything, and we're going to secure all that information properly. All right, so then the question of segregation comes up. That question really starts with who uses or needs to access the documentation related to that contract, who within your organization, and where do they go to get access to that information, and how is that information exchanged between people within the organization. If you have, for example, maybe a minority amount of your business in DoD, then more than likely, not everyone in your organization needs access to that documentation. Just the folks in sales or purchasing or manufacturing or engineering or finance that need to get to that information should have access to that information. So you can maybe narrow it down, which if you can do that, if you can logically reduce the scope of what needs to be protected, at least from an electronic point of view, computer point of view, then the opportunity of segregating or creating what's called an enclave in your network or in the cloud, where that information could be kept. And you could have an internal policy, do not put information anywhere else except for this designated location where we have implemented or are in the process of implementing the 110 controls. So that early discussion and discovery within an organization can save money, big time money and trouble down the road because you're narrowing what needs to be protected. There are different ways to do it, from SharePoint settings to dedicated cloud platforms to a physical separate network, a single separate computer where people go and access the documentation. You have to figure out the convenient way that it works within your organization. But if you can narrow it down, it will help. And then it's a matter of where are we going to keep this and how we're going to secure that information, that network, that environment to this level. Maybe that's your phase one. Get a place that's secure to the level we need, prepared, then maybe later come back and apply a lot of those things to your main network. But a lot of little companies don't have the IT resources or budget to take on the whole thing. And this could be a more affordable way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Appreciate that. Raj, I'm going to reintroduce you, Raj Sidhu with InTech. Can you maybe speak a little bit to the timing of this? I think there's and Howard addressed this a little bit, but kind of double down on the need to be compliant now with the FARS and DFARS requirements, or NIST 800-171, and how that relates to eventually what will be CMMC. I think there's some thoughts that people could delay this waiting for the audit. But I know there's many reasons to be cyber secure.
Sure. Thank you, Kate. So yes, I think there's a misconception or somehow some of the folks believe that you could just kick the can down the road, and to an extent they have been able to do that. But what really needs to happen at this point is, if you haven't started on your CMMC journey, you need to sooner than later. You cannot wait for CMMC 2.0 to be ratified and the controls to be disclosed and everything. We know what's going to happen. We know that it's not going backwards. There's a few things that they've done that are going to help the smaller organizations, but regardless, you're still going to have to get started. We've worked with a couple of agencies, couple of manufacturing organizations that essentially, when we told them, that they were not going to pass their SPURS test, or they were going to score really, really low, that their contracts would be in jeopardy, they kind of laughed it off and said, yeah, we'll see. This is a threat that is brought up often. Well, starting last year, that started happening. So, I know one of our clients that is a prime for Northrop Grumman had a PO that they would not approve. So, it was costing this customer somewhere around $80,000 a week or something like that in revenue lost. So, the controls that we wanted them to put in to get them through the basic, FAR 15, the 15 controls that they were too shy from meeting the controls, but it was some basic things like, escorting a user, or escorting a visitor, and then keeping logs of that. Well, and then I think their second one was they were sharing accounts, and they did not want to do that. Well, it took us only 2 days to remediate all those issues once they realized how much revenue they were going to lose. So, sometimes it's one of those things where, unfortunately, as consultants, we're not able to convey the risk that they have until it starts to hit them, with actual dollars. So, our focus is always to get started as soon as possible. At least start working through your poem and your system security plans, and at least get somewhere, at least get started. If not, and one of the things that we like to do is work with Impact Washington and PNDC, and we've gotten several grants for some of these organizations to get through. Even if it's a $5,000, $10,000 grant, it goes a long way to get you started. So start talking to PNDC and your Impact Washington representatives, because there's money out there for especially specific to CMMC.
Great. Howard, I know you've talked a little bit about going through the requirements, even the FAR requirements, which are the most simple of the ones we've discussed. Can you talk a little bit about documenting that process that would be in a way that you could present it to somebody that might ask for proof at some point? You're on mute.
I mean, that really is the proof in the pudding. I mean, the documentation. The companies that I have worked with, go through their for 7012, their plan, and they have, it's in a notebook, if you will, for each one of the NIST items, and what they're doing, and then how they have audited that. You can't just have something that you stick on your shelf. You have to have some way of internally reviewing and documenting that you have, that you're actually doing it. It also goes for the POAMs that that people have, that that they come up with. I mean, in concept, it's think about it. If you were, if somebody, the IRS was coming in to audit you, what do you have to prove that you're doing, these, whether it's CMMC cyber hygiene, or whether it's the elements in the FAR, that you're meeting those particular items. So I mean, I've seen some people that have like a spreadsheet with different columns, and then explaining where the source information can be, because it's great to have a spreadsheet, but there has to be something that backs up what's in that spreadsheet.
Great, thank you. Do any of our other panelists have any comments on that? Okay, we've got a technical question here for Raj. What are your thoughts on SharePoint and Microsoft's defaults security in regards to NIST and CMMC?
It does not meet the requirements. I mean, there's so this is a loaded question. What we suggest you do is that you have some sort of a data classification policy where you you classify all incoming data and the data that you have throughout your systems. And that kind of should drive, what kind of systems you should put in place. And if it's deemed that you have potentially CUI, FCI, or CDI on any of those systems, including Office 365, which I'm going to use as the umbrella for SharePoint and email, then you have to have a specific plan that you're on, specific subscription that you're on. The default licensing does not meet the requirements.
Great. Awesome. I know we've talked a lot about controlled unclassified information. Any thoughts on if you don't have CUI, maybe if you don't have these defaults, are there good cybersecurity hygiene? We'll use that word that CMMC originally used, that any company should be looking at as a compliance standard, just as good business practice. Scott, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, Kate, I guess I'll start with a point that probably should be raised at this point. If a company is doing work with the DoD, but there's no technical information being exchanged, so you realize that maybe you're providing a service, or maybe you're providing an off-the-shelf product. I know that's been exempted in the past. You still have a contract with the government or with a prime, and so that's where the FCI fits in. That level 1 protects. So any information that's not available publicly related to a contract that should remain private, just between you and your customer, is considered FCI. Obviously, if it's the original RFP that's posted, or information about those who won the contract is posted publicly on a government website, well, that's not protected, obviously, because it's out there. But anything that's internal and only exchanged with your customer is that federal contract information. And that's where the 17 practices of level 1 that are based on the 15 practices of the DFARS Clause that was mentioned, that's where those requirements come into play. So as a bare minimum, going through those 17 practices is good business, and it's the minimum of the minimum, shall I say? If you're trying to do two things at once: number one, get started on your cyber journey; number two, comply with regulations. I realize that CMMC certification and requirements are not here yet, but if you're at all doing any work related to DoD, everyone's going to have to pass through level 1 to get to level 2. Those 17 practices are incorporated in the 110 practices. So that, to me, would be an excellent place to start.
Great. Any of our other panelists have anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, so from not considering the CUI, but just from a hygiene standpoint, in an application for insurance, the controls that are listed, that's coming from the other side, is where actuaries looked at all the information and said, okay, this is where the losses are happening, so these are the things that we want to tighten up on. So looking at those controls, that will show you some of the main things where losses are happening. But if you're just getting started, just looking at controls, I think can be detrimental from a compliance standpoint. But talking with a professional like Raj or Scott and saying, hey, I would like to get secure, how can I get started? That conversation is really how to get started, because they can take a look at your systems, they can take a look at the way you do business, and see risks that, you know, an application is not going to see. And at the end of the day, these controls are meant to be guidelines to help people get security, but are not, you know, aren't what every company needs. Oh, you have these controls, now you're secure. So starting that conversation, I think, is definitely the first part.
Hey, Rick, if I could just quickly reply to that, I totally agree with you. And you made a key point that it starts with understanding your systems. So different companies operate in different ways, and some networks are, you know, old and archaic, and others are pretty state of the art. Some are in the cloud, and some are on premise, and some are a hybrid, and there's all kinds of different permutations. So any blanket statement that anyone would make it needs to be taken, you know, through the filter of understanding what your current needs are, because while there are some common risks on any kind of electronic system, it absolutely depends on what your system and how it's configured.
As human nature, having set controls or, you know, set rules makes people feel comfortable. But hopefully you know, most of the people that I talk with, they're trying to move past that. And so eventually we're going to, you know, rise above the applications and the certain things and actually say, okay, you are secure to the amount that you can be. And but until then, we're going to be working with controls, and we're going to be working with, you know, check boxes on applications. So making sure that, you know, the person you're working with knows what they're doing is very important.
And shameless plug coming up. What we've done over the last 2 years is we've created some really cookie cutter solutions when it comes to figuring out where you are at with CMMC, and, you know, the gap, where, you know, what's missing, what the discrepancies are, and then what it's going to take to get you there. So if you're a company of under 100 employees, we have a package. It's about $2,500. I think it's a little bit less than that, where we come in and we'll do an assessment for you, and we tell you exactly where your gaps are. So, you know, you don't have to use us. There's you know, plenty of companies out there that will give you the peace of mind with a very, very small you know, amount of money, to where you can actually figure out what you're doing right, and, you know, where you need to go as far as your resources and what products you may need. And not only that, but if you don't have the budget, what it's going to take for you to budget for a CMMC journey. So, you know, please start somewhere. If you need to, you know, if you need to get going, there's lots and lots of options, including contacting Impact Washington. I know they've assisted many companies in funding and also providing guidance.
Awesome. Thank you. We have an audience question here. What might be a prioritized acquisition with regards to third-party assessments? Howard, do you have any thoughts on that? You're on mute. There we go.
I mean, that, you know, that's an excellent question. I really don't have a good answer to that. You know, I would imagine that when they're finalizing the rule, they're going to try to define what that term means. Maybe one of the other panelists has some thoughts.
Yeah, Howard, my understanding is that the first announcement of CMMC 2.0, when last November, they talked about this bifurcation of level 2, and they said there are going to be some CUI are going to be identified as more sensitive than others, and so they'll call it, you know, prioritized. Most recently, I see they're backing off of that rapidly and saying the whole idea of bifurcation is under consideration, whether that's ever going to really make sense, and if it does, only a small handful of level 2 certifications will not require the third-party certification, which is what the bifurcation was what everyone was looking for. Hey, can I get out of this too? But I think it's not defined yet. It's probably the best answer.
Thanks, Scott.
Great. Another audience question, can you talk about the impacts on small and micro businesses on the POAM, and that's the plan of action and milestones? If I may probably wrongly simplify that, kind of what needs to be done on your cybersecurity plan and checklist. How's that being removed as we go through the CMMC 2.0 process? I guess it's allowed under NIST 800-171, and now it's looking towards you cannot have open items on your POAM. Raj, do you want to comment on that and maybe clarify the way I butchered that question?
And I'm not sure I completely understand, but is the question related to the level 1 requiring self-assessment, or is this?
Yeah, I think the POAMs were allowed originally, like you could have open items on your POAM as long as you had a plan to take care of them. We heard on CMMC that those were, you could have no open items on your POAM. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not
Raj,
100% certain. Go ahead, Scott.
Raj, I can jump in on that. So the exception allowed that POAM items could be open came from 7012, the original regulation. And that was basically saying you need to self-attest that you've reviewed all 110 requirements and that you either have implemented or have plans to implement the 110. That's what you're attesting to. So it really was sort of wide open, but you had to say we're working toward 110. With CMMC 1.0, and that was the one where they jumped maybe a little too far, right? They got out over their skis, as they say. They said that we're not going to allow a POAM, any POAM items to be open. You have to get 110. So, boy, being an ISO consultant, to say that there's no possibility of a finding and corrective action from an assessment just makes my stomach turn, because these are real people with, issues that come up, and these are technical things. And so anyway, that's my personal opinion. Sorry about that. But they said it's 100% or fail. That was basically what they were saying with 1.0. With 2.0, they've said we're going to allow open POAM items, but we are going to identify which of the 110 you can be permitted to have open. So the highly critical items, generally we think that's the 5-point items on the DoD assessment methodology document. Those higher point items, when you're doing your SPUR score, those are probably going to be the ones that you cannot have an open item on, but the others with the lower point values may be allowed to be open for 180 days or whatever they're going to allow. I'd say stay tuned. It's not clear. Meanwhile, work on the 110 and probably prioritize those marked with 5 points in the defense assessment methodology document.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will point out a comment in the chat from Jerry Leishman with Cortac Group, who's been a frequent speaker on these. He's actually on the CMMC accreditation body. So he had some comments on timing with that. Raj, let's do one more question here. I think we'll end with what we started with actually on the speaker meeting before this call. You had some good comments about who to involve in this process. When you're a small business looking at practically getting this going, getting the things done that you need, who should be involved in the cybersecurity process?
Sure. So one of the comments we often hear is when we're discussing the CMMC journey and what it's going to take, and look at some budgetary numbers, it's usually, the comment is, well, this is more than we've spent on our entire IT budget over the last year. And, that obviously is an issue. And so what happens is, a lot of times when we're having these conversations, I will not even, expand on this until the right folks are in the room. So for a smaller organization, it's the it's always the stakeholders. For a smaller organization, it's maybe the owner or the owners, a general manager. But when you have a finance department and you have a CFO, a controller, those are the folks that we try to always make sure that they're involved. You want to also make sure that your HR folks are involved, and then obviously operations is a key. But at the same time, this process should not be driven by your IT folks. I'm going to say that again. This is not an IT, CMMC journey is not just solely dependent on your IT folks. It needs to be, you need to have the proper people, the appropriate people in these meetings in order to make some of these changes that are usually affecting the entire organization. So, always make sure that you have the right folks involved. And take the time to educate them, because the biggest thing I've learned that helps us overcome some of these objections is, once they understand the risk that is that's involved, and how they're going to mitigate that risk, that is key. And in order for you to get to that level, you have to make sure that the right ears are listening, and the right folks are involved in these conversations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I'd like to invite Damon Nix back on the line to talk a little bit about the cohort program you have going.
Yeah, I mentioned it in the chat. We have it's really a very limited opportunity, but I know that some of the folks on the call today may be interested in, and it's certainly pertinent. We're looking to recruit a small group of companies to go through a cohort NIST 800-171 implementation, sort of targeted towards CMMC level 2, folks who may be challenged there, particularly companies who may be smaller and might not have the typical resources. It's going to be a cohort approach that begins sometime this summer and would carry on into next year. It'll be a multi-month engagement, sort of slow pace, walking through NIST 800-171, learning, doing homework approach. We have a few partners involved, but if there's a company that's interested here, and I've already got one request, we'll certainly just email me. I'll put my information's in the chat. So certainly reach out to me, and I'll connect you with the right person here at Impact Washington to talk about that. And as Raj mentioned, we've been able to help a number of companies with sort of limited initial engagements to do some assessments and understand their current state. That's always a big question as companies try to get and evaluate, where they're at. There's some, certainly we can help companies get connected with folks like Raj and Scott at Core Solutions and Jerry Leishman. And I know I'm going to leave people out because I started naming names, but all the great partners here are resource partners that we connect with. So all the experts here, we're so proud to work with all of them. So we don't have any specific grant funding right now, but we're seeking it. We're always looking. I actually just joined the application for some funds recently. So hopefully we'll have some news in the near future about some funding opportunities. But we do have connection and great relationships to some really strong legacy programs here in the state of Washington. So if you have cybersecurity interest related to whether it's CMMC or just getting basic cybersecurity hygiene going for your company, please feel free to reach out to Impact Washington. We'd love to connect you with an expert who can help you with that.
Right. Thank you. And I will say that PNDC has a program for some Oregon companies, a few spots left if you need some support. And do reach out. I think all of us have connections across the Pacific Northwest. If you happen to not be in Washington or Oregon, if you're in Idaho, Alaska, or anywhere, I think we can all point you to partners in any state. So thank you all for being on the line today. I'd like to again recognize our sponsor of this this month's program, along with Impact Washington and PNDC. We'd like to thank InTech Consulting for being on our sponsor of March's program and making this program possible. These are monthly programs. I'm going to put up the agenda here. For our next program is April 5th. Please go on pndc.us's website and you can register for that. And we'll also, there's recordings of the forums here this year, and I'm going to pull up Impact Washington's YouTube, a link to that. There's recordings of last year's programs as well. So lots of good information out there. I want to thank everyone for participating today. Rick, Raj, Scott, Howard, Damon, all our partners. I do want to recognize also Dale King with PNAA on the line and Jeff Stell with Business Oregon that have definitely helped us get the word out about this program and supporting it. Damien, am I missing anything? Anything else we need to cover?
No, just look forward to seeing everyone next month.
Awesome, awesome. Please remember you can download your chats. I'll leave the room open for a little bit. Click on the 3 little dots next to the chat and you'll have the option to save it to your computer. There's lots of good conversation and connections there. Awesome. And that concludes today's program.